The sun blazed mercilessly over Tombstone's dusty main square, casting long shadows between the weathered buildings that lined the street. Jack Hollister adjusted his worn hat brim, shielding his eyes as he surveyed the crowd gathering around the makeshift auction platform. At 43, Hollis carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd seen too much and said too little. His weathered hands rested on his gun belt, fingers unconsciously tracing the leather holster that had saved his life more times than he cared to count. "Hi, how are you? Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick, and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much, and continue with your story." "Step right up, folks. We got ourselves a fine selection today," barked Silas Crane, the auctioneer whose greasy smile never reached his cold eyes. "Horses, cattle, and, well, let's just say we got something special for those with particular needs." Hollis had come to town for supplies, nothing more. His small ranch 20 miles outside Tombstone barely sustained him, but it was enough. Solitude was what he craved, what he needed. The ghosts of his past demanded it, but something about the crowd's restless energy made him linger, his instincts prickling with unease. "Now then," Crane continued, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper, "we come to our final item of the day. A boy, age 12, strong as an ox and quiet as a church mouse. Perfect for ranch work, domestic duties, whatever you might need." The crowd parted as two burly men dragged a small figure onto the platform. Hollis felt his blood run cold. The boy couldn't have weighed more than 80 pounds, his clothes little more than rags hanging from his thin frame. But it was his eyes that struck Hollis like a physical blow. Wide, terrified, yet somehow defiant. Those weren't the eyes of a broken child. They were the eyes of a survivor. "Starting bid is $50. Crane announced. "60, called out Buck Morrison, a notorious saloon owner whose establishment was known for its cruelty. His companion, a scarred man named Vern Watts, nodded approvingly. Hollis had heard whispers about Watts, a bounty hunter with a reputation for bringing in his quarry dead more often than alive. 70, shouted another voice from the crowd. Hollis watched the boy's face as the bidding continued. The child's gaze swept the crowd, and for a moment, their eyes met. In that instant, Hollis saw something that made his chest tighten, a desperate plea for help, mixed with a resignation that no 12-year-old should ever possess. $100! Morrison's voice boomed across the square. The crowd fell silent. It was an enormous sum for a child, more than most men made in 3 months. Morrison's grin widened as he stepped forward, already counting the boy as his property. Going once, going twice. $200. The words left Hollis's mouth before he'd consciously decided to speak. Every head in the crowd turned toward him, including Morrison's, whose face had gone purple with rage. Well, well, Crane chuckled, clearly delighted by the unexpected turn. We have ourselves a bidding war. Mr. Morrison, your response? Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Vern Watts placed a restraining hand on his arm. The bounty hunter's eyes were fixed on Hollis with an intensity that made the cowboy's skin crawl. $250, Morrison growled through gritted teeth. $300, Hollis replied without hesitation, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. He was using nearly every dollar he had to his name, but something about the boy's situation had awakened a protective instinct he thought had died years ago. Morrison started to speak again, but Watts whispered something in his ear that made the saloon owner's face go pale. After a moment of heated discussion, Morrison stepped back, his expression murderous. Sold to the gentleman in the black hat, Crane announced, pointing at Hollis. Come collect your purchase, sir. As Hollis approached the platform, he caught fragments of conversation from the dispersing crowd. Most were speculating about his motives, but one exchange made his blood run cold. Told you someone would try to interfere, a gruff voice muttered. Don't matter, came the reply. We know where he lives. Boy ain't going nowhere. Hollis climbed onto the platform and handed Crane the money, his eyes never leaving the boy's face. Up close, he could see the child was even younger than he'd first thought, with intelligent green eyes and auburn hair that caught the afternoon light. There was something familiar about his features, though Hollis couldn't place what. "What's your name, son?" Hollis asked gently as Crane cut the ropes binding the boy's wrists. The child looked up at him with a mixture of wariness and hope. "Isaac," he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Isaac Carter." "Well, Isaac Carter. My name's Jack Hollister, but most folks call me Hollis. You're safe now." Isaac's eyes filled with tears he refused to let fall. Are you going to hurt me?" The question hit Hollis like a physical blow. "No, son. I'm going to take you somewhere safe, get you fed, and figure out how to help you. That's a promise." As they walked toward Hollis's horse, a magnificent black stallion named Thunder, Isaac suddenly grabbed his arm. "Mr. Hollis," he whispered urgently, "there are bad men looking for me. Really bad men. If they find me—" "They won't," Hollis said firmly, helping Isaac onto the horse. "But I need to know. Why are they after you?" Isaac's hand moved instinctively to his chest, where Hollis noticed a small bulge beneath his tattered shirt. I can't tell you. Not yet. But they killed my pa because of what I know. They'll kill you too if they find out you helped me." As they rode out of Tombstone, Hollis felt eyes watching them from every shadow. The weight of Isaac's words settled over him like a shroud, but he'd made his choice. Whatever secrets this boy carried, whatever danger followed in his wake, Hollis would face it. He'd failed to protect someone once before, a mistake that had cost him everything. He wouldn't fail again. Behind them, Vern Watts watched from the saloon doorway, his hand resting on his gun. He turned to Morrison with a cold smile. "Don't worry, Buck. We'll get the boy back, and when we do, that cowboy's going to wish he'd minded his own business." As the sun began to set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson, Hollis and Isaac rode toward an uncertain future. Neither of them knew that their meeting would set in motion a chain of events that would shake Tombstone to its very foundations, or that the quiet boy clinging to Hollis's back carried secrets that powerful men would kill to possess. The flickering flames of the campfire cast dancing shadows across Isaac's young face as he hunched over a plate of beans and hardtack. 3 days had passed since they'd left Tombstone, and Hollis had chosen their campsite carefully. A hidden canyon with only one entrance, surrounded by towering red rocks that would make it nearly impossible for anyone to approach unseen. "You're not eating much," Hollis observed, settling down across from the boy with his own plate. "You need to keep your strength up." Isaac looked up, his green eyes reflecting the firelight. "I'm not used to people being kind to me." His voice was barely above a whisper. "The last family that took me in, they weren't good people." Hollis felt his jaw tighten. "How long have you been on your own, son?" "Since Pa died, about 6 months ago." Isaac's hand moved again to his chest, to whatever he kept hidden beneath his shirt. "He was a U.S. Marshal, Marshal Thomas Carter." The name hit Hollis like a thunderbolt. He'd heard of Thomas Carter, a legendary lawman who disappeared while investigating corruption in several Arizona territories. The official report claimed he'd been killed by Apache raiders, but there had always been whispers of something more sinister. "Isaac," Hollis said carefully, "your father, how did he really die?" The boy's eyes filled with tears he'd been holding back for months. "They shot him, right in front of me. Said he was getting too close to the truth about something called the Tombstone Ring." Hollis's blood ran cold. The Tombstone Ring was a name whispered in saloons and back alleys, a network of corrupt officials, outlaws, and businessmen who controlled everything from mining claims to cattle rustling throughout the territory. If Thomas Carter had been investigating them. "What did your father tell you before he died?" Hollis asked gently. Isaac reached into his shirt and pulled out a small silver locket, tarnished with age. "He gave me this. Said it contained proof that would bring down some very powerful people. He made me promise to get it to Sheriff Ada McKenna in Tombstone. Said she was the only lawman he trusted." Hollis stared at the locket, understanding dawning on him. "That's why those men are after you. They know you have evidence. Ha. Pa said the locket contains a list of names and locations where they hide their stolen goods. Bank robbery money, cattle even people they've taken. Isaac's voice broke. He said some of the most respected men in Arizona are part of it. Before Hollis could respond, Thunder whinnied nervously from where he was tethered. The horse's ears were pricked forward, alert to something in the darkness beyond their camp. Hollis immediately doused the fire with sand, plunging them into darkness. "Stay low," he whispered to Isaac, drawing his Colt .45. "Don't make a sound." The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then, from the canyon entrance came the sound of horses' hooves on stone. Multiple riders, moving slowly, searching. "I know you're in there, boy!" The voice that echoed off the canyon walls was gravelly and cold. Vern Watts. "You and your new friend. Come out now, and maybe I'll make it quick." Hollis counted at least 4 distinct sets of hoofbeats. They were outnumbered, trapped in a canyon with only one way out. But he'd been in worse situations before. "There's another way out," Isaac whispered so quietly Hollis almost missed it. "Pa and I camped here once. There's a narrow passage behind those rocks." Hollis looked where Isaac was pointing. In the moonlight, he could barely make out what looked like a crack in the canyon wall. It was a desperate gamble, but staying meant certain death. "Can you make it through?" Hollis asked. Isaac nodded. "I'm small enough, but you... I'll manage. Go. Now." They moved like ghosts through the darkness, Isaac leading the way toward the hidden passage. Behind them, the sound of approaching horses grew louder. Hollis could hear Watts giving orders to his men, spreading them out to cover all possible escape routes. The passage was even narrower than it had appeared, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. Isaac slipped through easily, but Hollis had to remove his gun belt and push it ahead of him as he forced his way through the gap. "Where does this lead?" he whispered as they emerged on the other side. "There's a trail that leads down to the valley. Pa said it was an old Apache hunting path." They moved as quickly as they dared down the treacherous trail, leading Thunder by the reins. Behind them, they could hear shouts of frustration as Watts and his men discovered their empty campsite. "They'll find the passage eventually," Hollis said. "We need to put as much distance between us and them as possible." As they reached the valley floor, Isaac suddenly stopped. "Mr. Hollis, there's something else I need to tell you. About the locket." "What is it, son?" "It's not just a list of names. Pa said there's something else hidden inside it. Something that proves who's really running the Tombstone ring." Isaac's voice was shaking. "He said the leader isn't who anyone would expect, someone everyone trusts." Hollis felt a chill run down his spine. "Did he tell you who?" Isaac shook his head. "He died before he could tell me. But he said when the time came, I'd know what to do with the information." They rode through the night, following game trails and dry creek beds to avoid leaving tracks. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they found themselves on a ridge overlooking a small settlement. "Bisbee," Hollis said, recognizing the mining town below. "We can rest here, get supplies." But as they approached the town, Isaac grabbed his arm. "Wait, look." In the distance, dust clouds marked the approach of several riders. Even from this distance, Hollis could make out the distinctive figure of Vern Watts leading the group. "How did they find us so fast?" Isaac asked, fear creeping into his voice. Hollis studied the approaching riders, his mind racing. "They didn't track us. They knew where we were going." He looked down at Isaac with growing concern. "Son, who else knew about Sheriff McKenna? Who else did your father trust?" Isaac's face went pale as understanding dawned. "The telegram. Pa sent a telegram before he died, telling someone we were coming to Tombstone. But I thought it was to Sheriff McKenna." "What if it wasn't?" Hollis asked grimly. "What if your father's message was intercepted? What if someone in Tombstone has been expecting you all along?" The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder. They were running out of time, and the terrible possibility that they were riding into a trap hung over them like a storm cloud. "We need to get to Sheriff McKenna," Isaac said desperately. "She's the only one Pa trusted. She has to be honest." Hollis looked at the boy's determined face and made his decision. "Then that's what we'll do." but we're going to be smart about it. If there's corruption in Tombstone, we need to know who we can trust before we show ourselves." As they turned their horses away from Bisbee and toward the distant town of Tombstone, neither of them noticed the figure watching them from a rocky outcrop above. A figure who immediately spurred his horse toward town, carrying news that would change everything. The game was becoming more dangerous with each passing hour, and the stakes were higher than either Hollis or Isaac could imagine. In Tombstone, powerful people were making plans, and the arrival of a certain cowboy and a boy with a silver locket was about to upset a carefully constructed web of corruption and deceit. Sheriff Ada McKenna stood at the window of her office, watching the sun rise over Tombstone's dusty streets. At 35, she was one of the few honest lawmen left in a territory riddled with corruption, and the weight of that responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her sharp blue eyes missed nothing as they surveyed the town she'd sworn to protect. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, turning as Deputy Frank Morrison, Buck's younger brother, entered with a telegram in his hand. "This just came in, Sheriff," Frank said, his voice carefully neutral. "Thought you'd want to see it right away." Ada took the telegram and read it quickly. Her face remained impassive, but her heart began to race. The message was brief. "Package arriving today. Handle with care. T.C." She'd been expecting this message for months, ever since she'd received word that Marshal Thomas Carter had been killed. Thomas had been more than just a fellow lawman. He'd been her mentor, the man who'd taught her that sometimes doing the right thing meant standing alone against impossible odds. "Thank you, Frank. That'll be all." After the deputy left, Ada locked her office door and pulled out a hidden drawer in her desk. Inside was a letter Thomas had sent her weeks before his death, a letter that had changed everything she thought she knew about Tombstone. "Ada," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I'm probably dead. The corruption here runs deeper than either of us imagined. The Tombstone Ring isn't just a gang of outlaws. It's a network that includes some of the most respected citizens in the territory. I've gathered evidence, but I need someone I can trust to see it through. My boy Isaac has a locket. Inside it is everything you need to bring them down. But be careful. The leader of the ring is someone you know, someone you trust. Watch your back and trust no one until you're certain of their loyalty." Thomas Ada folded the letter carefully and returned it to its hiding place. She'd been preparing for this day for months, but she still felt the weight of uncertainty. If Thomas was right, then some of the people she worked with every day were part of the conspiracy that had killed him. A commotion outside drew her attention back to the window. In the distance, she could see a dust cloud approaching town, several riders moving fast. As they drew closer, she recognized the lead rider, Vern Watts, the bounty hunter who'd been asking questions around town for the past week. Ada's hand moved instinctively to her gun. Watts claimed to be tracking a runaway boy, but something about his story didn't add up. The amount of money he was offering for information was far too high for a simple runaway case. The door to her office burst open without a knock. Buck Morrison strode in, his face flushed with anger and exertion. "Sheriff, we got a problem," he announced. "That cowboy who bought the boy at auction, he's kidnapped the kid. Watts has been tracking them for days." Ada kept her expression neutral. "That's a serious accusation, Buck. What evidence do you have?" "Watts saw them heading toward Bisbee, moving fast, avoiding the main roads. What innocent man travels like that?" Buck's eyes were hard. "We need to form a posse, bring them back." "I'll handle this personally," Ada said firmly. "If there's been a kidnapping, it's a matter for the sheriff's office." Buck's face darkened. "Now see here, Ada." "Sheriff McKenna," she corrected coldly. "And I said I'll handle it. That's final." After Buck left, clearly frustrated, Ada began to plan. If the boy Thomas had written about was indeed in town, she needed to find him before Watts did. But she also needed to be careful. If the corruption Thomas had discovered was real, then she couldn't trust anyone. She was still planning when young Tommy Fletcher, the telegraph operator's son, came running into her office. "Sheriff McKenna, there's a man and a boy hiding in the old mine shaft outside town. My pa sent me to tell you. They asked him to get a message to you, but they wouldn't come into town." Ada's pulse quickened. What did they look like? The man was tall, wore a black hat. The boy was small, maybe 12 years old. They said to tell you they had something that belonged to Marshal Carter. This was it. Ada checked her weapons and gathered her gear. Tommy, I need you to do something very important for me. Don't tell anyone else about this message. Not your father, not Deputy Morrison, not anyone. Can you do that? The boy nodded solemnly. Yes, ma'am. Good. Now go home and stay there until I get back. Ada left town by the back trail, avoiding the main streets where too many eyes might see her. The old mine shaft was 3 miles outside Tombstone, abandoned when the Silver Vein played out 2 years earlier. It was the perfect place to hide and the perfect place for an ambush. She approached carefully, her hand on her gun. "Hello?" she called out when she reached the mine entrance. "I'm Sheriff McKenna. I got your message." A tall man emerged from the shadows, his weathered face cautious but determined. Behind him came a boy with green eyes and auburn hair who looked exactly like Thomas Carter had at that age. "Sheriff," the man said, "I'm Jack Hollister. This is Isaac Carter. I believe you knew his father." Ada felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Isaac, you looked just like your pa when he was your age." She knelt down to the boy's level. "I'm so sorry about what happened to him. Thomas was a good man." Isaac's eyes filled with tears. "He said you were the only one he trusted. He said you'd help us." "I will," Ada promised. "But first I need to know, do you have the locket?" Isaac nodded and pulled the silver locket from beneath his shirt. "Pa said it has everything you need to stop the bad men." Ada examined the locket carefully. It was beautifully crafted, with intricate engravings that seemed to form a pattern. "Isaac, did your father tell you how to open this?" "He said the key was in the pattern. Something about following the stars." Isaac traced one of the engravings with his finger. "He used to tell me stories about following the North Star to freedom." Ada studied the engravings more closely. They did indeed form a constellation pattern. Ursa Major, the Big Dipper, with the North Star clearly marked. She pressed the star-shaped engraving, and with a soft click, the locket opened. Inside were 2 items. A folded piece of paper covered in Thomas's careful handwriting, and a small brass key. "My God," Ada whispered as she read the list. The names included some of the most powerful men in the territory: judges, politicians, business owners. But it was the name at the top that made her blood run cold. "What is it?" Hollis asked, seeing her expression. Before Ada could answer, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon. Many horses, moving fast. "They found us," Isaac said, his voice tight with fear. Ada quickly closed the locket and handed it back to Isaac. "Keep this safe. Whatever happens, don't let them get it." She turned to Hollis. "There's another way out of here, through the mine tunnels. They're dangerous, but—" "Sheriff McKenna!" Vern Watts's voice boomed across the canyon. "Come out with the boy and nobody has to get hurt." Ada drew her gun. "Like hell," she muttered. Then louder. "Watts, you're trespassing on official sheriff's business. Turn around and head back to town." Watts's laughter was cold and humorless. "I don't think so, Sheriff. See, I got orders from someone with a lot more authority than you. The boy's coming with me one way or another." "Me? Who's giving you orders, Watts?" Ada called back, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. "Someone who's been very patient, but is getting tired of waiting. Someone who wants that locket real bad." Ada looked at Hollis and Isaac. The mine tunnels were their only chance, but they were treacherous and unmapped. People had gotten lost in there and never come out. "We don't have a choice," Hollis said grimly. "Lead the way, Sheriff." As they disappeared into the darkness of the mine, Ada couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far more dangerous than just unstable tunnels. The name at the top of Thomas's list kept echoing in her mind, and she realized that their real enemy wasn't Vern Watts or even the Tombstone ring. Their real enemy was someone who knew exactly where they were going, someone who had been planning this moment for a very long time. Someone who had been playing a much longer game than any of them had realized. The 3rd chapter of their desperate flight was ending, but the final confrontation was approaching fast. And when it came, they would discover that the truth about the Tombstone ring was more shocking than any of them could have imagined. The mine tunnels stretched into darkness like the throat of some ancient beast. Ada led the way with a flickering torch, its light casting eerie shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Behind her, Hollis kept one protective hand on Isaac's shoulder while his other rested on his gun. The sound of their pursuers had faded, but they all knew it was only a matter of time before Watts found the mine entrance. "How well do you know these tunnels?" Hollis asked quietly. "Well enough," Ada replied, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "There's an old exit about half a mile deeper in. It comes out near the cemetery on the edge of town." Isaac stumbled slightly on the uneven ground, and Hollis steadied him. "You doing okay, son?" The boy nodded, but his face was pale in the torchlight. "Sheriff McKenna," he said suddenly. "The name at the top of Pa's list, who was it?" Ada hesitated, then stopped walking. In the flickering light, her face looked haggard and older than her years. "Isaac, your father discovered something that's going to be very hard for you to hear." "Tell me," Isaac said with a maturity that belied his 12 years. "I need to know." Ada took a deep breath. "The leader of the Tombstone ring. It's Judge Harrison Blackwood, the territorial judge, the man who's supposed to represent justice in this territory." Hollis felt his blood run cold. Judge Blackwood was one of the most respected men in Arizona, known for his fair rulings and his crusade against corruption. If he was behind the ring, that's impossible, Hollis said. "Blackwood's the one who's been pushing for investigations into territorial corruption." "The perfect cover," Ada said grimly. "Who would suspect the man leading the fight against corruption of being the most corrupt of all? He's been using his position to eliminate competitors, seize property through false legal rulings, and eliminate anyone who gets too close to the truth." Isaac's hand moved to the locket. "Pa said the brass key was important too. What does it open?" Ada examined the small key in the torchlight. "I'm not sure, but knowing your father, it's probably evidence he hid somewhere safe." A distant sound made them all freeze, voices echoing through the tunnels behind them. Watts had found their trail. "We need to move," Ada whispered. "The exit isn't far now." They pressed deeper into the mine, the air growing thinner and more oppressive with each step. The voices behind them grew louder, and occasionally they could see the glow of torches reflecting off the tunnel walls. "There!" Ada pointed ahead to where a shaft of daylight pierced the darkness. "The exit." They climbed through the narrow opening and emerged into the late afternoon sun near Tombstone Cemetery. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. They were surrounded by the graves of men who had died in this lawless town, many of them victims of the very corruption they were now fighting. "We need to get to my office," Ada said. "I have a safe there where we can—" "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Sheriff." They spun around to find Judge Harrison Blackwood standing among the tombstones, flanked by 6 armed men. The judge was a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore an expensive suit and carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Judge Blackwood," Ada said carefully, her hand moving toward her gun. "What are you doing here?" Blackwood smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Cleaning up a mess that should have been handled months ago. You see, Sheriff, I've been very patient. When Marshal Carter started getting too close to certain business interests, I gave him every opportunity to back down. Unfortunately, he was too stubborn for his own good." "You killed my father," Isaac said, his young voice filled with a rage that made even Blackwood's men shift uncomfortably. "I gave the order, yes," Blackwood replied without a trace of remorse. "Just as I'm about to give the order to finish what should have been done that day. You see, boy, that locket contains more than just names and locations. It contains evidence of a federal land fraud scheme that could bring down half the territorial government. I simply can't allow that information to become public." Hollis stepped protectively in front of Isaac. "You'll have to go through me first." Blackwood chuckled. "Mr. Hollister, isn't it?" "Yes, I know all about you. A former lawman yourself, if I'm not mistaken. Lost your family in a raid 5 years ago while you were away on duty. Tragic, really. But that tragedy is about to be repeated." The words hit Hollis like physical blows. His family, his wife Sarah and his young daughter Emma, had been killed by raiders while he was pursuing outlaws. The guilt had driven him to isolation, to the lonely existence he'd been living ever since. "You know nothing about my family," Hollis growled. "On the contrary, I know everything, including the fact that the raid wasn't random. You were getting too close to certain operations in your jurisdiction. Your family's death was a message, one you apparently didn't understand since you're here now, interfering in my business once again." The revelation staggered Hollis. His family hadn't died because of bad luck or his absence. They'd been murdered because of his job, because he'd been doing what was right. "You bastard," he whispered, his hand moving to his gun. Now, Blackwood said, raising a hand. "Let's not do anything hasty. I'm prepared to make you all a deal. Give me the locket, and I'll let you ride out of here alive. You can disappear. Start new lives somewhere far from Arizona. The boy can even keep the money from his father's estate. What's left of it anyway. And if we refuse?" Ada asked. Blackwood's smile disappeared. "Then you'll join Marshal Carter in that cemetery behind you. The choice is yours." Isaac suddenly stepped forward, pulling the locket from his shirt. "You want this? Come and take it." "Isaac, no!" Hollis reached for the boy, but Isaac was already running toward the judge. What happened next would be talked about in Tombstone for years to come. As Isaac approached Blackwood, he suddenly veered toward one of the larger tombstones. The brass key from the locket fit perfectly into a small hidden lock in the stone's base. With a grinding sound, a section of the tombstone swung open, revealing a hidden compartment. "Pa said I'd know what to do when the time came," Isaac called out as he pulled a leather portfolio from the hiding place. "He hid the real evidence here, in Uncle Samuel's grave." Blackwood's face went white. "Kill them! Kill them all!" The cemetery erupted in gunfire. Hollis drew and fired in one smooth motion, dropping two of Blackwood's men before diving behind a marble angel for cover. Ada's gun barked twice, and another man fell. But they were outnumbered and outgunned. It was then that Isaac did something that would save all their lives. The boy had noticed something the adults had missed, fresh hoof prints leading to the cemetery from the direction of town. As bullets flew around them, he stood up and waved the portfolio over his head. "Federal Marshal Thompson!" he shouted. "We're over here!" From behind a line of tombstones, 6 federal marshals rose with rifles trained on Blackwood's men. Marshal Thompson, a grizzled veteran with steel-gray hair, stepped into view. "Judge Harrison Blackwood," Thompson called out, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and federal land fraud. Drop your weapons." The fight went out of Blackwood's men immediately. Faced with federal marshals, they threw down their guns and raised their hands. Blackwood himself seemed to age 10 years in as many seconds. "How?" he whispered. Marshal Thompson approached, keeping his rifle trained on the judge. "Marshal Carter sent us a telegram before he died, told us to watch for a boy with a locket. We've been tracking you for weeks, Judge. That portfolio the boy just found contains copies of every document Carter gathered, bank records, property transfers, correspondence. You're finished." As the marshals took Blackwood and his men into custody, Isaac ran to Hollis and threw his arms around the cowboy's waist. "We did it," he whispered. "We stopped them." Hollis knelt down and hugged the boy tightly. "No, son, you did it. Your father would be proud." Ada approached them, her face showing a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "What happens now?" she asked Marshal Thompson. "Now we clean house," Thompson replied grimly. "This conspiracy goes deep, but with the evidence Carter gathered, we can root out every last member of the ring. It's going to take time, but justice will be served." As the sun set over Tombstone, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Hollis and Isaac stood together among the graves. The boy looked up at the man who had saved him, and Hollis saw something in those green eyes that he hadn't seen in years. "Hope. What happens to me now?" Isaac asked. Hollis smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn in 5 years. "Well, I've got a ranch that could use some help, and I've got a lot to learn about being a father again. If you're willing to teach an old cowboy, that is." Isaac's face lit up with joy. "I'd like that, Mr. Hollis. I'd like that a lot." As they walked away from the cemetery together, neither of them looked back. The past was buried with the corrupt judge and his ring of criminals. Ahead lay a future filled with possibility. A lonely cowboy who had found his purpose again, and a brave boy who had found the father he'd lost. In the end, it wasn't the fastest gun or the strongest arm that had won the day. It was courage, trust, and the unbreakable bond between a man and a boy who had saved each other in ways they were only beginning to understand. The story of the lonely cowboy and the boy he bought at auction had come to an end, but their real story, the story of a family forged in hardship and sealed with love, was just beginning. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.